Hello, I'm Carol Gunsberg. I'm an editor with Voice of America, the taxpayer-funded international newscaster based in Washington, D.C. Um, we're here this evening with uh, the local chapter of SPJ, where we're going to discuss putting a local tinge on global stories. While people are joining us, we want to go over a few things about how it will run. This is the International Community of Society of Professional Journalists, and it's a community of journalists encouraging press freedom globally. Our aim in these talks is to connect journalists with other journalists and experts around the world. We want to create opportunities for you to engage with our guest speaker this evening as well, and you'll have direct access with her. The format is really simple. The guest and I will have a conversation, and while we chat, you can pose questions in the chat, in the Q&A option, and that's going to usually be at the bottom of your screen. You can leave technical questions or concerns toward the end of that chat. And the co-chair of the international community, Dan Kubisky, will be keeping an eye on that chat as well, and he'll be posting links to articles that you might be interested in that will supplement our conversation this evening. I want to remind everyone that this talk is being recorded and it'll be placed on SPJ's YouTube channel. Maybe I can tell you a little bit about myself as well beyond SPJ and beyond Voice of America. I started out, perhaps like many of you, in community journalism. I worked for a small daily in the Hudson Valley and then went to a couple of other newspapers and spent the bulk of my time at the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel, where I covered a range of things and was a features editor. And I did a lot of developing stories with international angles, sometimes from Milwaukee, sometimes from elsewhere. We know that local news covers the bread and butter of our daily lives. It covers education and courts and city councils and neighborhood events. And these are essential for daily living. It helps us make decisions. But the way that the world is connected today helps us appreciate events on a global scale. And so how do you localize those significant events? A war in Israel with Hamas, or Ukraine, or the Democratic Republic of Congo. Well, we have someone who's shown us a very smart way of doing that. This evening, we have with us Denise Dunbar. She is the DC SPJ chapter president. She's also publisher and executive editor of the Alexandria Times. And at the and the Alexandria Times has developed a reputation locally, certainly, as a resource for information and as an outlet for very good storytelling. Please welcome Denise Dunbar with us.
Thank you, Carol.
And Denise, why don't we start off with what led you to make room in the Alexandria Times to decide that you wanted to pursue international stories for your audiences?
Well, it's a good question because my newspaper is very hyper local. We don't really even cover very much of the Fairfax County portion of Alexandria. We really try to, because we're a very small staff and Alexandria has roughly 165,000 people. We have wonderful neighborhoods. We have Old Town that feels like a small town, but we also have big city problems. And so there's no shortage of issues to cover. My first love was really international relations. I had a double major in college in journalism and political science. worked for a couple of years for the Charlotte Observer newspaper after graduating undergrad, but then I went back to grad school and got a master's in political science, focusing on international relations. And from there, I actually got a job at the Central Intelligence Agency as an intelligence analyst, focusing on the Soviet Union. I was actually Boris Yeltsin's biographer when I was at the CIA, and actually got to meet him. So things from that era in particular have a special place in my heart. So when Russia invaded Ukraine, I took it personally, actually. And so, we're like, how can we localize this? And we may talk at some length at other stories that we did, but I wrote another story earlier this year that was about the freeing of the political prisoners that were in Daniel Ortega's prisons in Nicaragua. And that one was also personal to me because the Sandinistas came to power in the 80s when I was at the CIA. And it's mind-blowing and horrifying that they're still in power or back in power now. So that particular story was a labor of love.
Uh, Tell me a little bit more about the demographics of the Alexandria Times, or of Alexandria, in your readership.
Sure. We are very blessed to have an extremely well-educated readership in the Alexandria Times. Like a lot of people within the Beltway, there's a lot of people with graduate degrees, and we have a core group of people in this city who are very, very passionate about what happens in their city, and so that's why we're sort of dedicated to that. I think good journalism is shining a light on places where people in power would rather not have the light shining. So we certainly do that with local issues, but the demographics of the city, well educated. A lot of people work in DC. Of course, COVID has sort of disrupted everything. We have around 17 to 18% of our city is Hispanic. I think about 22 to 23% is Black. We have, although we have more than 100 different ethnic groups living in the city of Alexandria. Last I heard, I think it was 117 different languages are spoken at Alexandria City High School, which is our mega high school that is left over from the Remember the Titans movie that I think everybody has probably seen multiple times. That's not necessarily a wonderful legacy to only have one mega high school, but that's another story entirely. But we have a very international community, and so it makes it easier for us to localize international issues.
Now that makes sense. One of the challenges, you're working for, you operate a smaller newsroom, and in any newsroom right now, budgets are tight. There are concerns about, how do you produce these stories? What are your resources for reporting and for editing? Just curious.
Yeah, that's a very good question. Limited, limited is what I can say. We have one full-time staff member who is our managing editor and a reporter as well. We have another young man who actually started with us last year as a freelancer, was so wonderful that we brought him on board as a reporter. Right now he's part-time, but I'm working really hard to get him on board full-time because he's just incredible. We also utilize a lot of freelancers and interns. We have a terrific relationship with the University of Maryland, so we get a fairly steady stream, usually in the spring and the fall. We have one, sometimes two interns from the University of Maryland who do a terrific job. They don't just come from Maryland, but that's where most of our interns have come from. If anybody's watching from one of the other area schools, we'd be happy to talk with you about getting some of your interns too. But we're just really blessed that there are a lot of good writers, a lot of freelancers who live in this area, and so we utilize a lot of them for stories.
Mm-hmm. Do you have a particular process for finding international stories? um, say that there's a development. Well, okay, let's look at Israel, and with very or actually, let's go back to the Russia-Ukraine, um, the invasion of Ukraine. Very quickly, I believe within a week, your paper had at least had an editorial localizing the Russian invasion. And so you were describing Alexandria as a city of immigrants and exploring things from that point. Um, can you talk about the development of that editorial?
Sure, we did an editorial, and then I think about a week later, we actually had a full-blown story. So back to what you initially said, we don't really go out of our way to look for stories to localize, but in this world, so many significant things happen that there's no shortage of issues to then go, how can we localize this? We're not going to look for sort of an insignificant thing to localize, but if there's something major that happens, the invasion of Ukraine, the earthquake in Turkey, I mean, how remarkable was it that we have a former ambassador to Turkey living in Alexandria, and he happened to be a family friend of our editor. So, I mean, that was just serendipity that came along. With the release of the Nicaraguan prisoners, it was a friend of mine in Alexandria who knows a government official who helped with the resettlement of one of those former political prisoners in Alexandria, who connected me, that sort of started us on the path to doing this story. And I wound up going down to the State Department, meeting with the man who had been the #2 person in Nicaragua when the sort of latest round of arrests by Ortega took place. So each story has sort of a different way of how that happened. With the invasion of Ukraine, it was one of my neighbors right around the corner from me in Alexandria is from Ukraine. So we started with her, Tatiana, and then we posted on social media and came up with a range of people. Tatiana actually hadn't been back to Ukraine in a long time, but so there was like a range of people. And so we were able to put that story together.
Thank you. You had talked a little bit about community as well, and you about exploring community connections that you have. You did that in the case of Afghans who had been resettled here. You wound up doing a story that knit together both that international aspect when some of those Afghan refugees were resettled in public housing or in local housing. Um, if you would please just talk with our audiences about the development of that story. And oh, thank you. Yeah, that was an important piece.
Thanks,
Thanks.
Dan. Yeah, so that one was, it was really sort of remarkable. That one was brought to our attention. Long story, but there's a local group called RAFT, which is Resettling Afghan Families Together. I became friends with one of the leaders of that group because our children were in a summer camp together, and we both volunteered in the kitchen. So Natalie and I kept in touch, and so her organization brought this to my attention, that these Afghan refugees that they had been helping, with English language lessons, with getting furniture in their apartments, just helping them in any way that they could with getting jobs. They're just a wonderful, wonderful group of people and a wonderful organization. And they brought it to our attention that these refugees were living in horrible conditions, and that their apartments were, I mean, they sent us some of the videos. Their apartments were rodent infested. In the middle of the daytime, like the people sat on their couch with a phone camera and just took pictures of all the rodents running around. We got still photos of children with bed bug bites all the way up and down their legs. I mean, it was horrific. It's horrific to think that people live in those kind of conditions in this country. And it's especially horrific that these are people who were refugees, who came to this country for refuge, who had risked that, these were the people who had risked their lives during the US presence in Afghanistan after 9/11. So these were people whose lives were in danger because of what they had done to help this country, and that these were then the conditions that they were living in. So that it felt important to me for us to tell that story.
We're very glad you did. I'm glad to have had the opportunity to read it too. Um, I'm wondering if you have advice for journalists covering for other journalists who are looking or who want to cover international issues, but from a local perspective. And maybe some of our journalists also can pitch in. Some of our observers can join in too. But first, Denise.
Sure. Yeah, I would love to hear from any people in the audience, whether you're community papers who are interested in localizing international stories, or whether you're international journalists who are interested in. I mean, it just seems to me, if you're an international journalist who is covering things in other countries, that there are, if it's an American, or if it's someone from the military, or if it's someone from that country who has lived in the United States, there's some small part of this country that they have come in contact with. And as you're doing your larger story, for your regular news outlet, you could think about, is there a local paper that I could reach out to and perhaps do like a human interest feature story about this person and their international role, whatever that might be, and how that connects back to their hometown.
One thing I didn't ask you about, Denise, during the pandemic, for instance, at one point, it was the COVID was described as the China flu. And I'm wondering if you at the Alexandria Times visited it from the perspective of, from a local perspective, and how that China flu might play out, or if
And
any of
that wasn't
your
really
colleagues.
it was never called that in Alexandria. We didn't really go there. So
I do know that in some places that that it was an issue and led to difficulties for people of Asian descent. And so that became a local story too. Not that
right,
COVID wasn't a global story, of course, but
right.
it was another angle to pursue.
Yeah, we
Um,
covered the heck out of COVID, but that really wasn't one of the that really wasn't one of the focuses.
I'm wondering if we have any questions from our audiences right now. Otherwise, um, we can explore some other ways. Denise, when I was thinking back, and I've been fortunate to cover some different things too, but some funny kind of story popped up. I was thinking about the intersections that we have internationally and locally through food or travel or other things. And one idea I had, since I was developing a food story, was on circus food, but not the food that you eat when you go to a circus, but the food that's prepared for the performers in a circus. And so there was a small circus that I was particularly interested in. It was visiting in the Maryland area, the Big Apple Circus, and so I went and hung out with with the circus the circus kitchens operator, and then learned about the potluck dinners by the performers too. And so you would have this melange of foods because you'd have people coming. The performers were acrobats, acrobats from Serbia, and um, large animal trainers from Argentina, and um, someone else from Peru, and um, someone from Oklahoma who was in the big top. And so you could explore all of those things. I did have a favorite line from that story. One of the large animal trainers whose mother came from Peru and she was a contortionist, and I can't remember what the father was, but as he said, he had circus on both sides, which good line. Anyway, but it was a way of exploring international connections again, but in a very compact area. And it also
Yeah,
meant good eating for me.
that's
So,
awesome. That's a great
yes.
story.
So, what are some of the other ways? Again, you talked about connections that community connections or others. Um, what else might lead you to an international story? Or if maybe you could talk about some of the other work that you've done related to this. You posted some of the stories in here. That ambassador to Turkey who lives in Alexandria.
Yes,
That was a really strong story.
thank you. I mean, he was fascinating, you know. I mean, he had done so many different things, and it was a really unusual opportunity to localize that story by having this former ambassador be able to share his experiences. He had been on the ground in Turkey previously when they had suffered their most recent worst earthquake prior to the one earlier this year. So he was able to discuss what the people on the ground were experiencing. He was able to talk about what the typical US government response is when there's, which I have to say, a lot of these international stories make me so proud of the people who work for our government. I mean, um, when you think about it, right? I mean, if something awful happens in the world, the United States government reaches out and tries to help. And, in the case of Turkey, we provided a significant help. And that's no small thing. That I think that these countries know that that they can count on us. And then and I'm sorry, I'm jumping around a little bit, but back to the Nicaragua story, this I think he's currently the head of the drug task force in Colombia. They don't stay in one position for very long at the State Department, but this man, Lance Higurli, is a hero. I mean, to sit there and interview him as he was telling about his role, it was like the honor of his career to be chosen by the US government to put together the mission. It had to be completely secret to go down and rescue these people, some of whom were indigenous farmers who had been in prison for 4 years. And like 3 hours before they got to the plane, they didn't know what was happening. They were whisked out of their prison cells in the middle of the night, put in Soviet vans with blankets over the windows. Some of them thought they were being taken to be executed. Some of them thought that they were taken to be shipped to Cuba. And instead, they were being rescued to come to the United States. And one of the most poignant photos is actually one that the State Department shared with us of one of the former prisoners when he exited the tramway into Dulles Airport, that he had the sort of victory reaction. So anyway, those stories to me, as someone who has previously worked for the US government, those are a joy to be able to share with people. And the rescue of the Nicaraguan prisoners was like a 2-hour media cycle thing. It was a little blurb, they were rescued, and that was it. So for me in our little paper to be able to share that full story was really an honor.
And what kind of feedback do you get from your audiences, from readers, to the international stories?
Well, it's interesting. It ranges. And I think that actually one of the participants had a question about what was the reaction to the Afghan story. So that one was really interesting. The most immediate reaction we had, and unfortunately I don't have that one in front of me, but there's a collage in the front that's our wonderful graphic designer at the Times put together, that is like a map of Afghanistan and the Statue of Liberty, and it's the Morgan Properties who was the owned the apartments that these people went into. There you can see. And then Lutheran Social Services, the U.S. flag, a portion of it, and then a rodent nibbling at the edge of Morgan Properties. And to me, in just a quick glance, that collage tells the story of what was going on here. Well, we didn't hear from Morgan Properties, and in fact, we reached out to them multiple times in multiple different ways to try to get them to comment for this story, and they wouldn't. But we heard from Lutheran Social Services the very next day, asking us, would you kindly remove our logo from that collage? And our response was an equally polite, no, we won't, because, while you do great good, in many ways, you're the ones who are placing these refugees in these conditions. And, even the story talked about how some of the people got moved out of their apartment, but because the property management people were not undertaking any sort of systemic cleaning up of the rodent and bedbug infestations, some other poor, unsuspecting person or family was going to move in and be dealing with the exact same thing. So no, we did not remove them, even though we think they're a terrific organization. But, that's just a case where, sorry, you don't like being associated with that, but there's a reason.
Right. And if you maybe clean up the properties or not clean up the properties, but place people in better properties, more constructive properties, that's useful too. I'm not seeing the questions, so I don't mean to be overlooking anyone, but so we may have to speak up, or Dan, I hope I'm not missing those.
No,
Again,
we have one question from D. Kenneth McNear. Could you say more about how you attract freelancers and interns to contribute? I'm finding that while the interest may be there, the skills of the writers or interns are quite limited. What would you do in terms of assessing potential writers, and how do you provide training?
That's a very good question. So, in the instance of the story that we wrote about the Hamas massacre in Israel, that we used a quote that a rabbi gave us, testing how much trauma one can hold. Originally, an intern with us, Dylan Jaffe, who did a great job, and was assigned to do this story. Dylan had actually lived in Israel for a time. I think she had an internship while she was there. I'm not positive if it was an internship or study abroad, but she had been in Israel within the last year. It quickly became apparent that this story was too complicated and too significant and too delicate, frankly, for just an intern to handle. And so I upped my involvement with that one from simply being the editor of the story to co-writing it with her. I conducted the interview with the rabbi. So we split up doing some of the interviews. And that worked out well from a division of duties. So I guess in any of these stories, complex stories, and that's true actually for local issues as well, we do utilize, even our staff members are young and inexperienced to a large extent. So I tend to be pretty involved with any kind of complex story that we run, but particularly an international one. So that's sort of how we do that. We and we also assess. I mean, Dylan had been with us for a couple of months at that point, so we had a sense that she had a higher skill level than some interns that we've had, and so that she was capable of doing or helping with this story. The Afghan refugee story was done by Lexi Jordan, who was a summer intern with us. She actually is in journalism school at Northwestern University, and then she did the story along with Wafir Salih, who at that point was he went to George Mason University, has been out for a couple of years, and he had been doing freelance work for us, and we realized this young man is a beautiful writer, and he really has a nose for true journalism. And so I had no doubt that the two of them together could handle this complex story. And I was still very involved with it. And to be honest, with that story at the end, they had done a good draft that I thought could be better. So with that one, I had them give me all of their transcriptions from their interviews, and I reworked that a little bit, and actually worked in the little punchy ending of that story. So you'll just have to go back and reread that one. But anyway, so I guess we don't just turn them loose; we work closely with them.
And are you able to retain them for, as you're building up that skill set?
Well, it depends. I mean, Lexi is actually back in college now. I think she is a junior. She could just be a sophomore, but she's actually continuing to do some just regular freelance writing, not just international stories, but she's just a terrific young journalist. And so we know what she's capable of. And so she continues to do some, just feature writing for us. So it just, we just have to assess with each of them what their current skill set is, and then the goal is that by doing a story like this for our paper, they're building on their skill set. They're learning how you research, how you fact check, how you structure a complicated story like this, so that the next time they might be able to actually do it on their own. And even their stumbles, and they had some stumbles with these stories, but we all do at times, and we learn from them, and we improve, hopefully.
Do you have any other editing support, Denise?
Yes. So our managing editor, Caitlin Meisner, a very talented young woman, she also edits all of our stories, and she actually runs our production on Wednesdays. We're a weekly paper, so we do production on Wednesday. We send out the electronic edition of our paper by 7 o'clock, I think is actually our standard time for that to go out. Our paper is actually printed at Washington Post Printing in the early evening of Wednesday nights, and our home delivery is actually usually finished by about midnight on Wednesdays. And so it's on people's doorsteps when they get up Thursday morning, and then the bulk delivery is done Thursday morning.
And I'm going to ask you just for a moment too, to let people know how you fund the operations. I mean, it's a free paper, right?
Yes,
but it's advertiser driven, I believe you said.
it is. It's really almost 100% advertiser driven at this point. And so that pays for the basic operations. It's free. However, we don't do subscriptions. So if you're not in our home delivery area, then you can't ask us to drop it for you, even if you want to pay. It just, we don't really have the capacity to do that. But we do have bulk delivery to, I think it's like 135 different locations. We actually bulk deliver to 13 different zip codes. So that goes not just to the city of Alexandria, it goes to Alexandria, Fairfax County, it goes into Arlington, it goes into Prince William County a little bit. So we really try to cover a pretty wide area and try to get, distribution to places where maybe folks don't have as much access to to the home delivery.
Thank you. Do we have any more questions from our community, from our participants in the audience, who might, perhaps you have ideas or stories that you'd like to share about developing a local lens on a global issue?
Actually don't see any more questions down there right now, but as follow-up, if there's anybody who is watching this who is a member of the international community and would like to talk more about ways that you might go about localizing stories. I mean, each situation is different. Each location that somebody's in, each sort of standing, somebody might report on, well, our former chapter president reported on space technology issues for Al Jazeera. So, I mean, it can, there's lots of different ways that you can be involved, with international, if not issues, then publications, I guess. But anyway, anyone who's on here who would like to talk either more about how, if you're an international writer, you can find sources for stories to possibly sell to, US papers, or if you're a community paper and you would like to talk with me more about how to go about localizing international stories, because I will say that each story is different. Each one of these stories that we've talked about was a very different situation. It could be a tragedy, it could be a military kind of thing. One of them was immigration, one of them was the rescue operation of the US government. So each of them were different, and our sources for the story were different, and how we went about finding people to talk about were different. But I would say it really starts with your local networks. Reach out to the people that and ask them to reach out to other people. If you have a college, even if you're someplace in the middle of the country, you probably have a community college that can have professors from all over the place, may have students from all over the place. So those would be really good resources. If you have a military base somewhere nearby, you probably have military families who have been, lived in a whole variety of places. The world is so interconnected that there's really almost no place in this country at this point that doesn't have people who have international experience. So, we are certainly blessed to be in Alexandria and have all of the people in this area who have lived all over the world, both U.S. citizens or native-born Americans, but also people who come to us from all over the world. But you don't have to be where we are to do stories like this. You might have to work a little harder to localize them, but there's probably a local angle to most big international stories virtually anywhere in the country if you look for them.
I was also thinking while you were speaking, Diana, that in many, so I grew up Catholic, and as the ranks of priests have been depleted, there are many international clergy who come and serve, and so that has been an import into the United States, and that's a way of addressing things. You had mentioned Alexandria High School, and we know that those schools and their families are really great sources and resources for storytelling and for getting a local angle on an international event. So that's another place. I think you're absolutely right about the community colleges too, because of the diversity there, and because often there are older students, some who are coming and working. Many of them are working as well as being students, maybe most of them. And all of them would have interesting, or many of them would have interesting stories to tell.
Yes, I truly think community colleges are just remarkable resources anyway. We are so blessed in Northern Virginia to have Nova Community College. I can put in a little plug for them. I think with their various campuses, I think they're the largest community college in the country when you combine the number of students at all the campuses, but they do a wonderful job and are certainly a great resource for many different things. We did have one more question, which was how do you overcome language barriers as you're doing your reporting? And that's a really good question. Because I'm not multilingual, and obviously our city is. So with the short answer is we love to hire people who can speak other languages. We had an intern a couple of years ago who spoke a couple of languages in addition to English, and so he was definitely able to go into some communities and get some stories that, we feel that particularly our Hispanic community is underserved in our city. And so one of the languages he spoke was Spanish. And so that was a really wonderful thing. It just so happens that the young man who was on the Afghan story, his name is Wafir Salih, he actually knows some Arabic. And so because of his ethnicity and his background, I think a number of the Afghan refugees opened up to him more than they would have perhaps to someone else. I think he conducted the interviews in English, but he did speak some Arabic, and he's just such a quiet, wonderful presence that he really got some terrific interviews for that story. So it's a definite barrier. The lack of we have such a small staff. Even if we each spoke a different language, it wouldn't really we still couldn't go out and speak the native language of all the people that we would like to cover. But particularly in a community like ours, it's really helpful if someone speaks Spanish.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. And of course, you can find allies, or you can find other people who can translate for you very often. You need to just be cautious about, Diana, you had talked about this, that trust factor or the safety factor. People need to know that they are speaking to you without concern that they're going to be arrested or deported or something like that. Some people will hesitate, and if there is some familiarity, they may open up more than they would with you. Any last questions? I know we are getting close to our cutoff time, and we have a tradition with the international community that we ask one final question of our guests. So I'm going to put this to you, Diane. What does a free press mean to you?
Well, funny you should ask. We actually have the answer to that inside the Alexandria Times, which is on the top of our opinion page. We run a quote by Thomas Jefferson every week that says, "Where the press is free and every man is able to read, all is safe." So I believe that a free press is the basis of democracy. And all of the other freedoms and rights that are spelled out in the Constitution, in the Bill of Rights, they're really meaningless if you don't have a free press. If you don't have a free press, you don't have freedom of speech. If you don't have a free press, I don't think you don't have freedom of assembly. You don't have you don't have a right to private property. And if those other rights begin to be eroded, the free press is the one that alerts people to the fact that this is happening. The reason that this session is actually taking place is because Dan and I met with a group of Turkish journalists who were visiting this country a couple months ago. And it was sort of heartbreaking to hear their stories because they don't have freedom of the press there. They report things as best they can, but if they say the wrong thing or if they try to investigate corruption or anything like that, the best thing that will happen to them is their platform will be taken away from them and they're likely to wind up in jail. So it was a stark reminder of the rights and privileges that we have in this country. And so the freedom of the press is the basis for everything. I will just say also, when I was in journalism school as an undergrad, the advisor to my newspaper on our newsroom chalkboard, he had a bumper sticker that read, "The First Amendment is absolute." And I firmly believe that. And actually, just one other thing, which I won't have this turn into a rant, but it's very concerning to me and in my role as SPJ chapter president, to hear even sometimes other journalists talk about the danger presented by disinformation and the need to sort of clamp down on that, because any control of that is going to come from the government, and it's going to be the government saying what speech is okay and what speech isn't. And I personally find that idea horrifying. So freedom of the press, freedom of speech, it's absolute. If someone is offended, it's worth it.
Thank you so much. I do appreciate that. Before we leave today, I want to announce that the SPJ has designated the headquarters of the VOA, or Voice of America, a historic journalism site. Yay, VOA. The ceremony for the dedication of a plaque commemorating this distinction will take place on Thursday, February 1st, so that's next week, Thursday, at 4 p.m. at the VOA headquarters in Washington, D.C. So it's between 3rd and 4th Streets in Southwest, well, not on the Independence side, but and following the ceremony, there will be a discussion with 3 former Voice of America directors and the current acting director on the legacy and future of VOA. So Dan is going to post the link to register for this event in the chat box. And if you're in the Washington area on that day, please come join us. We'd like to celebrate. And you can register for the event at the Washington, D.C. chapter website, spjdc.org. And I will look forward to seeing you there, as will Dan, as will Diane. And if there are any last questions, terrific. Otherwise, I would like to thank our guest, Diana Dunbar, for this wonderful opportunity. Sorry, what am I saying, Diane? Denise, for this wonderful opportunity to speak today. So, Denise, any last words?
There was one more question, which was, do you have insurance? Are you ever worried about legal action? Anybody in the media business has to be worried about legal action. And yes, we have insurance.
And have you ever had to use it?
No, knock on wood, but it's there.
I'll do that for you.
Back down from doing what we're supposed to do.
Great. I guess we're at time, but unless there's anything else, Dan? Otherwise, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us here this evening. And Denise, thank you for sharing your insights on community journalism and localizing those international stories.
Thank you so much, Carol. I've enjoyed our conversation, and hopefully my email is out there. If not, it's ddunbar@alextimes.com. If anybody wants to follow up with a question or have a chat, I'm happy to talk with you. Thanks again, Carol and Dan.
Thank you.